Frank Sinatra's panic attack story. It was supposed to be another flawless performance, until Sinatra stopped mid-song and 12,000 people witnessed something they were never meant to see. October 15th, 1962. The Chicago theater was bathed in amber spotlight, cigarette smoke creating ghostly patterns above the packed house. The ornate ceiling, decorated with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, reflected the warm glow like stars in a smoky sky. Frank Sinatra stood center stage in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, the orchestra weaving the familiar opening notes of "Strangers in the Night." This was routine, another sold-out show, another perfect evening of Sinatra magic. But backstage 30 minutes earlier, that magic felt more like a curse. Sinatra had sat in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the Hollywood-style mirror, surrounded by bare bulbs. The face looking back was the same one that had graced magazine covers and movie screens for decades. But tonight, something was different. The eyes that had charmed millions looked tired, haunted. The pressure had been building for months. Federal investigations into alleged mob connections had turned every newspaper into a potential landmine. The constant scrutiny from the press had become suffocating. The divorce from Ava Gardner still haunted him years later. His recent engagement to Juliette Prowse had ended abruptly 3 weeks ago, leaving him once again alone with his music and his demons. The sleeping pills weren't working anymore. He'd been staring at hotel ceilings for weeks, his mind racing through conversations with lawyers, meetings with investigators, arguments with ex-lovers who wanted nothing more than distance from the chaos that followed him everywhere. Now, as he walked from dressing room toward stage, each step felt heavier than the last. The familiar sounds of pre-show, orchestra tuning, audience murmuring, stagehands making final adjustments, seemed amplified, overwhelming. Strangers in the night, exchanging glances. His voice cut through the smoky darkness like silk over steel. His fingers moved automatically, conducting invisible rhythms, his body swaying with practiced ease of a man who had owned every stage he'd stepped onto. In the third row sat a young couple holding hands, the woman wearing a dress that probably cost her a month's salary just for this night. In the balcony, an older gentleman sat alone, tears already forming in his eyes before Sinatra had even begun to sing. These were his people, the ones who understood that music wasn't just entertainment. It was salvation. The first verse flowed as it always did. But as he moved into the second verse, something began to shift. It started small, a flutter in his chest, like a bird trapped behind his ribs. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the lyrics, on the faces in the audience, on the familiar comfort of performance. Halfway through the second verse, it hit him like a freight train. His chest tightened like a vice closing around his lungs. Breathing became shallow, erratic, as if his body had forgotten how to perform this most basic function. The stage lights that had always felt warm suddenly blazed like interrogation lamps, pressing down on him with unbearable heat. His collar felt like a noose tightening around his neck. The orchestra sounded underwater, familiar melodies distorting into something strange and threatening. Wondering in the night, what were the chances? His voice caught. A tremor so small that most people might have missed it, but Sinatra felt it like glass cracking in his throat. The note that should have been smooth came out rough, uncertain. His hands, which had always been steady, began to shake visibly. The panic came in relentless waves. First, the terrifying realization that something was desperately wrong with his body, the instrument that had never failed him. Then the crushing fear that everyone in that vast theater could see his disintegration. Then the desperate primal need to flee, to run, to hide somewhere dark and safe where no one could witness this public collapse. His heart began racing, not the pleasant quickening that came with performing, but something frantic and uncontrollable. Each beat felt like thunder in his chest, so loud he was certain the entire audience could hear it echoing through the sound system. His mouth went dry as desert sand. His palms became slick with sweat, making the microphone feel slippery and unreliable in his grip. Time began to distort in ways that defied logic. Seconds stretched like taffy while simultaneously racing past him like bullets. He could hear individual conversations from the audience. A woman whispering about his pale complexion, a man coughing in the fifth row, the clink of glasses from the bar and back. Sinatra stopped singing. The orchestra, sensing something wrong but unsure what, began to falter. The trumpet player held his note uncertainly. The piano player's hands hovered over keys. The bassist looked up with concern etched across his face. Gradually, reluctantly, the music died away. 12,000 people held their breath, unsure what they were witnessing. Some thought it was part of the act. Others, more perceptive, began to sense that something real was happening, something unscripted and uncontrolled. The great Frank Sinatra stood frozen at the microphone, face pale under spotlights, chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. His usual confident posture had collapsed into something smaller, more vulnerable. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, nobody moved. In that profound silence, individual stories began to unfold throughout the theater. In the fifth row, Sarah Henderson, a nurse who had saved for months to afford her ticket, felt her own chest tighten in sympathy. Behind her, Thomas Walsh, a World War II veteran, recognized the frozen posture he'd seen in fellow soldiers during the worst moments of war. He gripped the microphone stand like a lifeline, knuckles white, the tendons in his hands standing out like cables under tension. In that silence, he heard his heartbeat pounding in his ears, felt the weight of 12,000 pairs of eyes watching him disintegrate. This was his worst nightmare, being seen as weak, as human. The man who had built his career on confidence, on swagger, on effortless perfection, was falling apart in front of an audience that had paid to see a god, not a mortal man with fears and doubts. He could have left, should have left. His manager was already moving toward the wings, ready with excuses about illness or technical difficulties. The band looked at him with concern and confusion. Security guards were positioned to escort him off stage if needed. All he had to do was wave that famous Sinatra smile and disappear behind the curtain with his dignity intact. Instead, Sinatra did something he had never done before in 30 years of performing. He told the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was quiet but clear in the sudden stillness, "I need to tell you something." Even speaking those words felt revolutionary. In all his years of performance, he had never broken character, never stepped outside the carefully constructed persona. The audience was here to escape their own problems, not to be burdened with his. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, something in their expressions stopped him. They weren't looking at him with disappointment or impatience. They were looking at him with concern, empathy, human recognition. The confession came slowly, hesitantly, like water finding its way through a cracking dam. "Right now, standing here, I'm scared." The admission felt like jumping off a cliff. "My heart is beating so fast I can barely catch my breath. My hands are shaking. I feel like I'm going to fall down." 12,000 people listened in absolute silence. "I don't know why this is happening. I've done this show 1,000 times. I know these songs better than I know my own name, but tonight I feel like I'm drowning up here." He loosened his tie with trembling hands, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting the careful grooming that was part of his armor. "You know what's funny? All my life, I've been singing about loneliness, about heartbreak, about being afraid, songs about feeling lost, about wondering if you're good enough. But I've been hiding behind the songs, hiding behind the image. Tonight, there's nowhere to hide." The silence was profound, sacred. People who had come for entertainment were witnessing something far more powerful, a glimpse behind the curtain of fame, a moment of raw human vulnerability that money couldn't buy. "So, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to sing for you, not as Frank Sinatra the performer, but as Francis, the scared kid from Hoboken, who never quite believed he belonged on stages like this." He gestured to the conductor, who raised his baton uncertainly. "And if my voice shakes, if I forget the words, if I have to stop again, that's okay, because that's real. And maybe, just maybe, that's what you need to hear tonight." What happened next transformed not just the evening, but everyone who witnessed it. Sinatra began "Strangers in the Night" again, but this time his voice carried something it had never carried before: complete, unguarded honesty. When his voice trembled, he let it tremble. When emotion choked his throat, he let the silence speak. The audience didn't hear perfection. They heard humanity. A woman in the third row began to cry. A man in the balcony who had been struggling with his own demons felt something loosen in his chest. Throughout the theater, people were experiencing something they hadn't expected: permission to be imperfect, to be afraid, to be human. Sinatra sang for 90 more minutes that night. Sometimes his voice was strong and sure, sometimes it wavered, sometimes he paused to collect himself, to breathe, to remember that he was safe. And with each moment of vulnerability, the connection between performer and audience grew stronger. During the final song, My Way, when he reached the line about facing the final curtain, Sinatra's voice broke completely. But instead of stopping, he let the audience carry the melody while he stood in the spotlight, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what his music had always been trying to say. After the show, people didn't talk about missed notes or shaky moments. They talked about feeling seen, understood, less alone in their own fears. The Chicago Tribune's review the next day was unlike anything the critic had ever written. Last night, Frank Sinatra forgot how to be a star and remembered how to be human. What we witnessed wasn't a performance, it was a revelation. Word of that night spread through the entertainment world like wildfire. Other performers began admitting their own struggles, their own moments of doubt. Judy Garland called Sinatra to thank him for showing that vulnerability wasn't weakness. The idea that perfection was required began to crack and crumble. Sinatra never spoke publicly about what happened in Chicago. When asked about it in interviews, he would simply smile and say, "Some nights, the music finds you instead of the other way around." But those close to him noticed changes. He began taking breaks during shows when he needed them. He started acknowledging when songs affected him emotionally. He created space for silence, for breath, for truth. The panic attacks continued occasionally throughout his career. But Sinatra had learned something that night in Chicago that changed everything. The audience hadn't come to see a perfect performance. They had come to feel connected to something larger than themselves. And sometimes, the most powerful connection happens, not when we show our strength, but when we reveal our struggles. October 15th, 1962. The night Frank Sinatra had a panic attack in front of 12,000 people and discovered that his greatest fear, being seen as human, was actually his greatest gift. That night changed not just Sinatra, but everyone who witnessed it. In the lobby afterward, strangers shared their own stories of fear and vulnerability with each other. Lives were forever altered by one man's courage to be real. The voice didn't matter that night. The real man behind it did.